Hello everyone. Today I would like to make a public service announcement to never forget your roots, which in my case means Stephen King, because my first video was about The Stand by Stephen King. So I'm gonna go back to my roots and read some more Stephen King. Or rather, I already read some more Stephen King because now I'm reviewing Pet Sematary by Stephen King. So Pet Sematary is a 1983 novel by the man himself, Stephen King. It follows a family named the Creed family as they move across the country from Chicago to a small town in Maine. It's always a small town in Maine with this guy. Can someone please tell me what the state of Maine did to this man? But anyways, they move to a small town in Maine because the father, Lewis Creed, is a doctor and got a job as a doctor at the local college. And this town happens to have a pet cemetery. Now, on the surface, this book is a horror novel. It's marketed as a horror novel, but really it's not necessarily about the spooky stuff. It's not about the creepy crawlies. This book is, at its core, an intimate story about loss and grief and how people cope with those things, or maybe don't cope so well with those things. One thing that stands out about this book pretty much immediately, and it's something that has stood out about Stephen King in the past, is the character writing. Right off the bat, you understand Lewis Creed, you understand who he is in here, you understand his perspective on the world, and it's so immediate, like it's so effortless on King's part. And he has this charming relatability that I've come to associate with Stephen King protagonists. Now, given that this is a story about loss, Lewis Creed is very interesting as a main character because he is someone who doesn't really struggle with the concept of permanence. And that sounds pretty vague, so let me go into depth with a couple of examples. For starters, he's a doctor, so he's under no delusions about life being anything close to permanent. He's constantly faced with the reality of death, and because of that, he has this sort of detached, objective view on the matter. And it's something that I think is pretty realistic for most doctors. You can't be sort of emotional about the idea of death at all times and also cope with dealing with it and preventing it on a day-to-day basis. But it goes deeper than just being a doctor, and I'm not sure if it is his perspective that led him to become a doctor or if him becoming a doctor has led to this perspective in other aspects of his life, but this perspective is ingrained in him on a deeper level than just his profession. It's noted in the book that he doesn't really stick to one hobby for very long, and so he's constantly moving through these different hobbies. He's not latching on to one thing and holding it close to his heart permanently over a long period of time. And that's kind of what I meant when I said he doesn't struggle with the idea of permanence. He doesn't get permanently sentimental about certain things and become emotionally distraught at the idea of separating himself from those things. He moves on through different hobbies. Even in his own leisure time, he is not attached to something long term. Right? This perspective is ingrained in him. And then there is the obvious fact, which is that he moved his entire family across the country for the sake of a new job, right? He uprooted his whole family. He didn't get sentimental about one specific location. He had no problem moving across the country. Now, these things are kind of insignificant on their own, but you put them all together and they give you a very clear perspective into his pathology, into how he sees the world. It's very well done character writing. So we have Lewis Creed, not really attached to things permanently, and then we have his wife, who is also a well-written character and is, in this aspect at least, kind of the opposite. See, she doesn't really deal with death well at all, for reasons that I won't go into here, but the fact is, she doesn't deal with it well. And this leads to tension and drama at certain points between her and Lewis. But it never devolves into feeling contrived or melodramatic for the sake of the story. It feels organic and natural. This is, conflict that I could imagine a married couple having, because these are perspectives that I could imagine two different people having and still being married despite having these differences. Now, you'll notice I haven't really delved into what actually happens when they get to this town that has this pet cemetery. What is the actual hook of the story? I haven't talked about that because it's not really the point of the book. It's a book about loss. It's a book about grief, and because of that, it's much more important to get a grasp of what the characters are like in here. That's what the book does, and it does it really well. And it takes its time to do that at the start of the book. This is something that it has in common with The Stand, and I talked about it in my review of The Stand, where he takes his time to introduce you to the characters separate from the actual meat of the story of the book. In The Stand, it was all about a plague that devastates society, and you get to know all the characters and see what their lives are like before the plague actually hits. In Pet Sematary, there are also things that happen of a supernatural nature to this family. That is a thing in this story. I don't want to give the impression that it's a straight drama, but in terms of what left a mark on me, it was entirely the characters and what's in here for the characters. In fact, I almost forgot that there was supposed to be any supernatural aspect to this story when I was reading the first chunk of this book, because the character drama is just so engrossing, so organic. It could have just been straight drama the entire way through, and I would have had no problem with that. Another reason I wouldn't have had a problem with it if there was no creepy stuff in this book is because of how good Stephen King is at portraying small town life and creating a setting that feels organic and feels lived in. It feels like a place with its own history, and I really appreciate that, which is something that he also does really well in 11/22/63, probably my favorite King book out of the massive 3 that I've read so far. Now, I don't want to explain exactly what happens as far as the story of this book goes, what exactly goes down to make it a horror story, but eventually something does happen, and the second half of this book, as a consequence of that, feels like this nightmarish fever dream, because it kind of is for the characters, and it's really, really harrowing and unsettling to read about. As you move towards the final act, this only gets worse and worse, and it's really disturbing, like genuinely disturbing and upsetting on a level that goes a lot deeper than just horror. I wouldn't really describe anything that happens in this book as traditionally scary, and I know that because I read the whole thing and I don't do horror very well at all. I'm a complete wuss, and I would have noped out way before the end if I was genuinely like traditionally scared, but I wasn't. It was disturbing and unsettling and hard to read on a psychological level, but it wasn't scary. I wasn't shaking in my boots. Like I said, this is a story about loss and grief, and those topics are hard to talk about. Those topics are hard to read about. And so a book that wants to do a good job of portraying these things and showing how people deal with them should be a little bit hard to read at times, and this book nails it. It really nails it. In particular, I was really impressed with Lewis's character arc, seeing where he starts and where he ends up and how he gets there as things happen to him and his family is pretty astounding, and it anchors the story from start to finish and does it in an extremely organic way. The changes that happen are totally believable and yet sound ridiculous when you say them out loud. And when I say it anchors the story, I do mean right till the very end. This book doesn't fall apart in the final act, in my opinion, which is an issue that a lot of people have about a lot of Stephen King books, and an issue that I had with The Stand. I thought the ending was really strong and provided a very nice cap to the story as well as the themes of loss and grief that he was presenting to the audience. As they say in this book, sometimes dead is better. This is a genuinely hard-hitting book. It's a genuinely great character study and a genuinely great study of loss and grief and what they do to a person. And I say this as someone who has never had a pet. You know, I don't want to spoil anything specifically, but it's called Pet Cemetary for a reason. So I'll leave it there. But I've never had a pet, and I still found this book incredibly hard-hitting. But if you have ever had a pet or suffered any tragic loss in your life, be warned that this is a very dark and very intimate look at those things. And so if you aren't emotionally ready for something like that, it might not be a good idea to read a book like this. I'm all for dark stories, but you know, there's a time and a place for things like this, and you have to figure out what headspace you're in and what headspace you are ready to be in with the fiction you read. So just be warned on that. Suffice it to say, I loved this book, but it's not perfect. There are still a couple of things that I wasn't really a fan of. It's mainly one thing. There is a plot element in this book that kind of reduces the agency of some of the characters. It kind of takes the decision making out of their hands a little bit, just a little bit, not completely, but I'm not really a fan of that in stories usually, especially not in character-driven stories, because I want the characters to be responsible for their decisions, and I want the consequences of their actions to actually be consequences of their decisions that they made because they decided that it would be a good idea at the time. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it was like a mind control story, because it isn't anything so egregious as that. You know, the characters are not completely stripped of their agency, but it is an element that's there, and I just kind of wish it wasn't there because of my own personal taste. If you feel differently, that's totally fine. So yeah, that's Pet Sematary. Now, this book has been adapted into a movie twice, once in the 80s and once last year. I haven't seen either one of the movies, so I don't know if they're a good idea to watch if it sounds interesting but you don't want to read it. All I can say is the book is really good, and if the themes and ideas that I've talked about here sound interesting to you, then I feel like you'll come away from this book having enjoyed it. Well, maybe not enjoyed it considering the subject matter, but appreciating the story. So yeah, that's the second Stephen King video that I've made and the third book that I've read by him. If you happen to be a Stephen King head, because I know there are some real serious enthusiasts of this man's work because he writes like a fucking machine, let me know what you think I should read next. For the record, my ranking so far is 11/22/63 first, Pet Sematary second, and then The Stand, which I did like quite a lot, but not nearly as much as the other two. So that about wraps it up. Hope you're having a good one. I still haven't come up with a tagline to end my videos with that I like, so I'm just gonna say peace out.